Hello, Sunday school teachers, preachers, and students. Welcome to SundaySchoolPreacher.com. This week's lesson is titled Faithful Despite Unfaithfulness, and God Hears Our Cry. God is faithful despite the Israelites' unfaithfulness yet again. A pattern is beginning to form for this newly freed nation. Once again, they cry out in the wilderness, wishing they had died in the land of their captivity. Just as God heard their cry, God hears our cry. Prayerfully, we don't have a pattern of unfaithfulness. This week, I review the beginning portion of this Israelite journey toward the Promised Land. The old generation from Egypt can't be trusted. Now it's up to the new generation to inherit the promise. We began last week with the Israelites just beginning their journey into the wilderness. This week's lesson continues that journey as they should be poised for conquest, but instead they cower in fear, rebellion against God, and faithlessness. They are at the border of Canaan, and spies have gone into Canaan to determine if the land is suitable for their conquest. Last week, after God delivers them from the hand of Pharaoh with mighty works and wonders, and after only 45 days in their journey, they complain bitterly to Moses because of their hunger. This week, after God has continued to sustain them with bread and meat from heaven, they're still faithless and in effect reject God by their disbelief. Of the 12 spies, only Joshua and Caleb return with a good report. The faithless nation believes the 10 and in effect rejects God. They could see everything God had already done, but they could not see what God could do through them. As we continue to understand how God is faithful, this week I focus on how God is faithful despite unfaithfulness in Israel. Some of the ideas surrounding this week's text include the terms fidelity and despair. Now, if you have Wi-Fi in your church Sunday school classroom or wherever you share this lesson, this channel is a good way to teach and discuss this week's lesson. With Wi-Fi, you can start and stop the lesson when and where you want to for discussion. What I provide is a concise overview of background, context, characters, themes, and topics that gets to the point, saves you time, and enhances your own teaching and study. If that's what you're looking for, you're in the right place. But the only way I know this is helpful is if you subscribe, click the like button, or say so in the comments. So please subscribe, like, comment, and then click the notifications bell so you'll be notified as soon as I upload next week's lesson. So with that said, welcome again to SundaySchoolPreacher.com, and let's go to work. So the background for today's text. Numbers is the fourth book of the Old Testament. Tradition has it that Moses is credited as its author. The New Interpreter Study Bible explains that the English title refers to the many numbers contained in the two census lists that form the central pillars of the book's structure in chapters 1 and chapter 26. So these censuses are central to the structure of the book. But the message of Numbers is the story of the old generation out of Egypt dying off as the new generation prepares to move into the Promised Land. The NISB also explains that the central narrative of Numbers is the spy story of chapters 13 and 14. Those are the two chapters we'll cover today. These chapters narrate the theme of judgment and death for an old generation and the birth and hope of a new generation of God's people. They tell the story of why the old generation lost the Promised Land and the new generation would receive it. That theme is a result of the old generation failing time after time after time to trust God. Their faithless acts of disobedience and rebellion ultimately led to their demise in the wilderness, while a new generation would be prepared to trust and follow God. So Numbers talks to judgment and death of the old generation, placed against the birth and hope of a new generation. Numbers covers the story of the Israelites in the wilderness, and that's a span of about 40 years. It opens with that generation, with the old generation that came out of Egypt, and the first census of the generation that comes out of Egypt of more than 600,000 is 603,550 males. So that does not include women and children. And this census is in preparation for the conquest of the Promised Land. The second census of the new generation occurs in chapter 26. So this 13th and 14th chapter deals specifically with the 12 spies, one from each tribe, going into Canaan to survey the land and determine if it's ready for their conquest. The 12 spies return after 40 days, and they return with a mixed report. They all report that the land flows with milk and honey, but only Joshua and Caleb report that they should move immediately to take the land. After hearing the faithless and exaggerated report of the 10 spies, the Israelites again cry out in despair. Once again, they wish to return to the land of enslavement back in Egypt. Some important words to consider for this text, or from this text, include fidelity and despair. So let's review last week and see how it connects to this week. Last week's lesson was taken from Exodus 16 and opened with the Israelites having been already delivered from enslavement in Egypt. They're now wandering in the wilderness at a place called Sin, between Elim and Sinai. They've been on their journey from Egypt for only about 45 days. In verses 2 and 3, the whole congregation complained against Moses and Aaron. They protest so severely that they imagine dying back in the land of their captivity. They complained, if only they had died by the hand of the Lord back in Egypt. I noted how these people are a people who have given up. There were no Egyptians around to enslave them. There were no slave masters around to whip them. There were no Egyptian soldiers around to slay them. Yet they desired to go back to the land of enslavement, back to whippings and beatings, and back to soldiers who could slay them. They've given up, capitulated, and thrown in the towel because at least in Egypt they had food to eat. I noted how they saw themselves in this foreign land, this wilderness. They saw themselves dying of hunger. So then they blamed Moses and Aaron for the hunger. I also quoted the New Interpreter Study Bible as it explained that life as a slave in Egypt is better than the risk of freedom in the wilderness. In verse 4, the Lord gives Moses a plan. The Lord tells Moses how bread will be provided and how the people are to gather the bread from heaven. But the Lord presents this as a test for the Israelites. God will rain bread from heaven, and the Israelites will gather only enough for their daily needs. And in this way, God will know if they'll follow God's instructions. Just as God gave the Israelites provision day by day, it's up to us to trust God for our daily bread. Verse 5 gave them instructions on how to gather in preparation for the Sabbath. On the sixth day, they're to gather twice as much in preparation for the seventh day of rest. In verses 6 and 7, Moses and Aaron explained to the Israelites the plan that the Lord has set forth for their provision. They tell the people, "In the evening you'll know that it was the Lord that brought you out of Egypt. And in the morning you'll see the glory of the Lord." Moses and Aaron want them to know that they aren't complaining to them, but to God. In verse 8, Moses makes it plain that the people aren't complaining against him and Aaron. They're complaining against the Lord. This won't be the last time the Israelites complain. They've seen the great plagues and experienced the great deliverance of God from their Egyptian enslavers. Yet a mere 45 days later, they're completely defeated with no enemy soldiers in sight. The text skips to verses 13 through 15, and here the Lord provides quail in the evening, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. After the dew lifted, there was a fine flaky substance on the ground, and they asked Moses, "What is it?" And Moses explains, "It's the bread that the Lord has given you to eat." And as we continue to study God's faithfulness and responses to God's faithfulness, this week we see faithfulness in the minority report of Joshua and Caleb. It is Joshua and Caleb who are faithful. The others are not. Not only are they faithless, but their rebellion and ultimate rejection of God is the cause of the old generation being condemned to wander 40 years in the wilderness until almost all of them had died out. The lesson this week is entitled "Faithful Despite Unfaithfulness," and God hears our cry. The scripture text comes from Numbers, the 13th chapter, verses 1 and 2. Then it skips to verse 17, part A, and then to verses 25 through 28, part A. Then we go to chapter 14, verses 1 and 2, and then it skips to verses 5 through 10a in chapter 14. I'll read that text for you now from the New Revised Standard Version. The Lord said to Moses, "Send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Israelites. From each of their ancestral tribes you shall send a man, every one a leader among them." Moses sent them to spy out the land of Canaan. And then we skip down to verse 25. It's a section entitled "The Report of the Spies." At the end of 40 days, they returned from spying out the land. And they came to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation of the Israelites in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. They brought back word to them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. And they told him, "We came to the land to which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey. This is the fruit of it. Yet the people who live in the land are strong, and the towns are fortified and very large." Then we skip down to chapter 14, and we begin at verse 1 and 2. Then all the congregation raised a loud cry, and the people wept that night. And all the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron. The whole congregation said to them, "Would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in this wilderness." Verse 5, Then Moses and Aaron fell on their faces before all the assembly of the congregation of the Israelites. And Joshua son of Nun and Caleb son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes and said to all the congregation of the Israelites, "The land that we went through as spies is an exceeding good land. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land that flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not fear the people of the land, for they are no more than bread for us. Their protection is removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them." But the whole congregation threatened to stone them. So what takes place in this passage? The lesson opens at chapter 13, verses 1 and 2, with the Lord speaking to Moses. The Lord instructs Moses to send men into the land of Canaan. The Lord specifies the land which I am giving to the Israelites. This is the land that God promised Abraham. The promised land and the nation of Israel were hundreds of years in the making. But now the descendants of Abraham were on the verge of receiving that long-awaited promise. The text skips to verse 17a, where Moses sends 12 spies into Canaan to explore the land and determine its suitability for their conquest. At verse 25, the spies have returned from their 40-day reconnaissance. The number 40 is used quite often in the Bible, and we'll see later that the Israelites would wander in the wilderness for 40 years. Jesus fasted for 40 days and 40 nights. It rained for 40 days and 40 nights in the great flood. In Exodus 24:18, Moses spent 40 days on Mount Sinai. And in Acts, the first chapter, verse 3, there are 40 days between the resurrection and ascension of Jesus Christ. So the number 40 occurs quite often and at significant times. But we shouldn't give this number any more significance than is needed. Merriam-Webster defines numerology as the study of the occult significance of numbers. While numbers often symbolize something, they should not be given divine meaning unless specifically stated to have divine meaning from God. Occult practices include numerology, astrology, witchcraft, tarot cards, and others. So in verse 26, the spies assemble at Kadesh in the desert of Paran to report their findings to Moses, Aaron, and the whole assembly. The spies showed them the fruit of the land. And then in verse 27, the spies reveal that the land flows with milk and honey. Not only do they tell of the goodness of the land, but they bring back evidence of the bountiful harvest that await them on the other side. In verse 28, despite them seeing the bountiful the bountiful blessing of the land, the spies report that the people are powerful and the cities are fortified and very large. I should note that the first census reported over 600,000 men. Historians report that this would have been an unusually large number of people because most nation states were not this large at that time. So it seems that these spies, they see the blessings possible in the promised land. They see the powerful people in the promised land. They see the large cities, but they don't see the fulfilled promise of God, nor do they see themselves as powerful in God's might. The text skips to chapter 14, verses 1 and 2, where the entire congregation lifted up their voices and cried, and the people wept that night. They wept because they have believed the exaggerated report of the 10 spies. The New Interpreter's Bible, one-volume commentary, explains that there are two versions of the spies' negative report. In the first version, the land flows with milk and honey. In the second version, verses 32 through 33, declare that the land itself is so bad that it eats its inhabitants. Additionally, the spies warn of giant Anakites and of a mythological and semi-divine race of giants known as the Nephilim. The Israelites see these giants and once again fall into fear. Instead of believing God, instead of believing they were powerful and strong and brave, instead of believing they were enough and that they had enough, they chose instead to believe the report of these men instead of the command of God. They're out of Egypt. They've been delivered from enslavement by the mighty works and wonders of God. And God has provided them with manna in the morning and meat in the evening. God has turned bitter water to drinkable water. Even with all these miraculous works, they cannot see how God will give them this promised land. Once again, they complain against Moses and Aaron. Once again, they wish they had died in the land of Egypt or in the wilderness. As they wept that night, God heard their cry. They cry out not in faith, but in unfaithfulness. They don't cry out in belief, but in unbelief. Theirs is not the cry of hope, but hopelessness. And although the old generation has seen the mighty works of God, this conquest is just a step too far for them to take. In verse 5, Moses and Aaron fall on their face before all of the assembly. They realize what the Israelites are doing. They realize this entire nation is choosing to reject God even after all that God has done for them. Verses 6 and 7 show Joshua and Caleb as the faithful few who believe God, who believe that God can and will do what God said God would do. They tear their clothes in frustration and declare again that the land they went through was an exceedingly good land. In verse 8, they explain that if the Lord is pleased with them, the Lord will give them this land that flows with milk and honey. In verses 9 and 10, they warn the Israelites not to rebel against the Lord and do not fear the people of the land. Instead of heeding the warning of Joshua and Caleb, the whole congregation threatened to stone them. So let's give the text some context. Perhaps you've heard someone say, "I'll believe it when I see it." Seeing and believing seem to complement each other. Yet sometimes it can be hard to believe what you see. These Israelites saw the mighty works of God. They saw them demonstrated in miraculous ways. Yet they could not believe what God had told them would come next. Not only had they seen the mighty works of God, but they also saw the evidence of a land flowing with milk and honey. Instead of believing what God would do, they chose instead to believe the exaggerations and lies about mythological giants. The people in the land were real, and they were no doubt powerful. But God is all powerful. The question for us today is whether we believe God or whether we believe myths. Key characters in the text. Moses, of course, is a key character. Moses is the first great leader of the Hebrew people. He's regarded by some as the author of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Moses is revered by Jews, Christians, and Muslims for his daring leadership and diplomacy, as well as his promulgation of the divine law. Aaron is a key character. Aaron is the brother of Moses and the first high priest of Israel. Aaron was a descendant of Levi's and a son of Amram and Jochebeds. Born 83 years before the Exodus, he was 3 years older than Moses, but younger than their sister Miriam. Joshua is a key character. Joshua is the son of Nun, a member of the tribe of Ephraim, and of Moses' lieutenant and successor. He was originally named Hoshea. Caleb is a key character. Caleb is the son of Jephunneh of the tribe of Judah, and one of the 12 spies whom Moses commanded to observe the land of Canaan. Key words in this text, not necessarily in the text, but good for discussion. One key word might be fidelity. And fidelity is the quality or state of being faithful. The fidelity of God is shown in God's dependability, trustworthiness, and reliability. Despair is another key word for discussion. And despair is utter loss of hope. Themes, topics, discussion, or sermon preparation ideas. One might be, I'll believe it when I see it. A second might be, just because you don't believe it doesn't mean it isn't true. Questions that you might ask your listeners. The old generation of Israelites would not see the promised land. Discuss why. And then a second question might be, Joshua and Caleb are the minority with a good report. Why is their report positive and the other 10 spies' report negative? And then a concluding thought. God promised Abraham that he would become the father of many nations. God also promised him the land of Canaan for his descendants. It was hundreds of years in the making, but it came to pass. God is faithful even when God's people are not. If God has promised you something, don't give up, don't give in. Be encouraged and keep the faith, because God is faithful. And a preview of next week's lesson. Next week, the lesson continues in the book of Numbers. And as we continue the God is faithful theme, we see God about to mete out the harshest of punishment against the nation of Israel. Faithful Moses steps in to plead the case for the rebellious and faithless people, and God changes God's mind. Instead of punishment, God grants forgiveness. The lesson is entitled, God Forgives. Thank you for joining me on this journey. I am Reverend Dexter Alexander, and you've been listening to SundaySchoolPreacher.com. The only way I know this is helpful is if you subscribe, click the like button, or say so in the comments. Please also click the notifications bell so you'll be notified as soon as I upload next week's lesson. And if you don't mind, please share this site with other Sunday school teachers, preachers, and students. Thank you, and may God bless you real good.